Aspiring author John Kennedy Toole is found dead at the age of 31. A decade later, he will become the first person to be awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for his opus, A Confederacy of Dunces.
His plan was to stay in New Orleans, finish the book, and then become rich and famous. And unfortunately, it didn't work out that way.
He doesn't leave a will, leaving the rights to his unpublished work up for grabs.
She resolved that if the Tooles were going to have 50% of it, then it wasn't going to be published.
The battle begins, and the dreams of a son and his mother will leave a family divided. But is it a legacy worth fighting for?
The fact that so many A-list actors died while trying to make this one book into a film has led people to believe that there's a curse.
American publishing company Grove Press has just bought the paperback rights to A Confederacy of Dunces, a new book by New Orleans author John Kennedy Toole. After a small initial print run, the book is quickly becoming a critic's favorite.
One of the things that Confederacy does so well is it recreates the local color of New Orleans. And no one has ever captured New Orleans as successfully.
He hit it right on the head. That's one of the things New Orleanians either appreciate or don't like, because he was so accurate in his depiction of the people of the city.
It is doing so well that in April of 1981, it wins the highest literary honor possible.
Once A Confederacy of Dunces became a smash hit, Grove Press bought the rights, and then it won the Pulitzer, and all of this money came flooding in.
It even catches the attention of Hollywood.
The film rights for The Confederacy of Dunces were originally bought by a 23-year-old executive at Paramount named Scott Kramer, and he fell in love with it.
But despite all of Confederacy's success, the man who created one of the most colorful characters in American literature is not around to enjoy it. John Kennedy Toole committed suicide 12 years earlier. No one knows why this gifted young man took his own life, not even the woman closest to him, his mother, Thelma. Thelma DeCoing is born to an old Creole family in New Orleans in 1901. At an early age, she's a talented pianist and singer who dreams of one day living the high life. John Dewey Toole Jr., a descendant of Irish immigrants, is one of the smartest boys in his high school. Thelma marries him in 1925.
He was a mathematical genius, and when they married, Thelma just assumed that he was going to make a brilliant career, and they were going to play a very important part in New Orleans society.
But things don't go according to plan. Instead of pursuing a career as an engineer, her husband takes a blue-collar job.
Well, as it turned out, John was brilliant, but he had no ambition. He became a used car salesman. He was very generous and kind, but he never provided enough income. And Thelma was always absolutely furious about that.
Pretty early on in their marriage, it seems that the relationship started to sour a bit. Thelma felt that he had not achieved the potential that he should have, and part of that was that he had not brought in the income to live the lifestyle that she wanted to live.
Even though things aren't going well, Thelma desperately wants a baby. For over a decade, they try to conceive, but doctors tell her she will never be a mother. She doesn't give up, and at the age of 36, Thelma finally gets the good news she's been praying for. She's pregnant.
And in a lot of ways, he was kind of a miracle baby.
John Kennedy Toole is born on December 17, 1937. After the disappointment of her husband, Thelma throws all of her hopes into Ken.
Well, Thelma's relationship with her son, Kenny, is what they called him when he was born. She was enamored with him. She had not been pregnant for the first 10 years of their marriage. There's a great story that Ken used to tell, and that was that one day She was at a party, she had a few drinks, she slipped on some stairs, and whatever was preventing her from motherhood was dislodged. And she got pregnant shortly after that. And he sort of reveled in this accidental origin of his existence. Really from day one, she saw him as a genius. I mean, she talks about him from the first time she looked into his eyes. She knew, not just beautiful, he was a genius.
As I have often said, I was very fond of Thelma, and I was very glad she was not my mother.
Thelma becomes obsessed with honing his skills, filling his schedule with private lessons in French, drama, and etiquette. She chooses his friends and limits his contact with his Irish cousins.
Thelma was starstruck from an early age. She wanted to go into the theater. She wanted to be a star. This didn't happen, and so she decided that Ken was going to be her star.
Of course, when he got much older, this intensity and this compulsion to do something great was not only a motivating force, but the negative underside is that if it's not achieved, of course, then there's feelings of failure that are difficult to grapple with. That's not only personal failure, but a failure that he failed his mother and perhaps what his destiny was supposed to be.
Ken turns out to be exceptionally talented in the arts, and when he declares at 15 that he wants to become a writer, Thelma is thrilled. At age 16, he finishes his first novel. The book is a secret that even his mother does not know about. 3 decades later, it will spark a family feud.
He wrote the Neon Bible for a literary contest. When it didn't win first prize, he put it away and never thought about it again.
Despite this rejection, Ken still nurtures a desire to become a published writer and goes on to be a top student at Tulane University before obtaining a master's degree at Columbia. In the summer of 1960, he's an assistant English professor at University of Southwestern Louisiana. It is here that he meets Joel Fletcher, who was also working at the university.
As I recall, he stopped by the office and we had a nice chat, and then neither of us was very happy about being stuck in dusty, hot Lafayette for the summer. And we spent a lot of time in going out drinking in country bars, and we knew some of the same people, so we were often invited to parties, and we spent a good bit of time together that summer. He was great company.
Joel and Ken would often go out drinking together at bars like Le Bon Temps Roule and Moulette's, places that are still around today.
We talked about literature. We talked about Flannery O'Connor. We both admired her work, and Evelyn Waugh. And also, I often listened to Ken's imitations. He would do wonderful impersonations of people he knew on the campus faculty.
Sometimes eccentric colleague Bobby Byrne would also tag along. He would later become Ken's inspiration for the central character, Ignatius J. Riley, in A Confederacy of Dunces. After that summer, Toole decides to return to Columbia, New York to pursue his doctorate. But in 1961, he gets drafted into the Army. He is sent to Puerto Rico to teach English to Spanish-speaking recruits. Ken excels in his role as an Army man, advancing to sergeant in under a year. Despite his success, he is looking for something more.
She was going to stay in New Orleans for the Christmas holiday and New Year's and fly back on the first week of January. And he got to New Orleans, and he had already been contemplating, he saw the end of his time in the Army. He knew it was coming. He needed to make the next decision, what he was going to do next with his life.
Ken draws inspiration from his hometown.
He's looking about his city and he recognizes New Orleans is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Then he goes back to Puerto Rico. He's laying around in the sun, drinking rum, trying to think, again, what is he going to do with his life? And that's when the idea for the novel finally kind of took shape and he started writing it.
Ken withdraws from the world and spends all of his free time feverishly typing away on a colleague's typewriter.
He starts in February or early March. By the end of that year, he had pretty much completed the book.
Set in New Orleans in the 1960s, the book revolves around Ignatius J. Riley, a 30-year-old highly educated but slothful man still living with his mother. When he's forced to find a job, he ends up interacting with many colorful characters. After Ignatius becomes a lucky dog hot dog vendor, his mother tries to have him sent to a mental institution.
The central character is a misfit, a very obviously bright man who can't seem to find his place in the community, even as he struggles going from job and task to task.
I think actually the creation of Ignatius is what has made Confederacy such a universal success.
With Manuscript in hand, Ken is released after a 2-year stint in the Army. Instead of returning to New York, however, he agrees to move back in with his parents.
He came back to a very bad situation in New Orleans. His father was ill and had to stop working, and so Ken really became the sole support of his family. They were in really dire financial straits.
One of the reasons he agrees to return to his family's home is because of his ace in the hole, A Confederacy of Dunces.
He accepted a job teaching at Dominican College, and his plan was to stay in New Orleans, finish the book, and then become rich and famous. And unfortunately, it didn't work out that way.
Ken sends his book to Simon & Schuster, the largest book publisher in the U.S., who initially expresses interest in the manuscript. High-profile editor Robert Gottlieb praises the book, but says it needs some work. There must be a point to everything you have in the book, a real point, not just amusingness that's forced to figure itself out.
He saw some problems with the manuscript. There are some problems with the structure. He talks about Ignatius Riley being a bit out of control. The fact that Ken just decided to send the manuscript to Robert Gottlieb because he liked the books that Gottlieb published, and that somehow the editor reads it and corresponds for 2 years without an agent acting in between them, this would be unheard of today. It suggests that clearly Gottlieb saw talent in Toole and felt there was something he could do.
By this time, Ken is once again working as a teacher while pursuing another doctorate degree.
Was Ken happy being a teacher? If you talk to his students, it seemed that he loved lecturing. There was a feeling that he really wanted to bring the wonderful aspects of literature to the world, but it was not how he wanted to be defined. It was not the career that he wanted.
For the time being, he seems content enough working on the revisions sent by Gottlieb.
He wrote me 8 letters while he was writing Confederacy and kept me up in his plans.
I must say that 8 airmail letters and 1 hour-long distance call from Simon & Schuster later, I am still faced with revisions. Although I am wildly funny often, funnier than almost anyone else around, the book is too intelligent to be only a farce. Broken and leering toothlessly, I may yet be on some book jacket. Despite Ken's attempts at revisions, version after version of A Confederacy gets rejected. Gottlieb eventually writes that the book is essentially missing a plot.
There is one letter that happens about a year after they start their correspondence. Gottlieb was struggling a bit to guide Ken while still offering a critique. And so the letter kind of shifts with praise to critique, and he says, you know, at this point, the novel doesn't seem to be about anything. This seemed to hit Ken very hard. It's important to recognize as well that not only was Ken opening the letters, Thelma took out the letter and started berating Gottlieb, talking about these fools in New York City and their high-rise Manhattan towers, and they just don't recognize art, especially the genius of her son. That cut him pretty deep.
Ken becomes desperate and depressed, convinced his labor of love will never get published. He starts drinking, gains weight, and his normally well-kept appearance turns sloppy. While he seeks medical help for headaches, he does nothing about his depression. Paranoia sets in.
The earliest indication seems to be in 1967 when a friend of his that he was stationed in Puerto Rico with came down to New Orleans, and Ken was going to show him around town, but there were some odd behaviors that Ken had. He started driving through the French Quarter, and he looked in his rearview mirror and believed that a group of Catholic schoolgirls that he taught were chasing him.
He thought that somebody had stolen his novel and that people were following him, and he was showing all the classic signs of paranoia.
He leaves his job, making him, like his father, a disappointment to Thelma. They argue constantly.
Being a dutiful son, he felt a responsibility toward his parents, and he tried his best to fulfill it. It must have been hellish living with Thelma. She was so overpowering and so demanding.
He put complete stock in the novel so he could endure the situation. But once he gave up on the novel, once it was clear that, to him at least, he couldn't edit anymore and he kind of decided just to stop, then he found himself in a New Orleans with aging parents that he had to support. I think the prospects of his life appeared grim at that point.
One night in January 1969, Ken and Thelma have a particularly nasty fight.
I imagine it must have been intense, it must have been heated for him to walk away from everything. He walked away not only from his parents, but from his job and from the city that he had previously said, you know, he could only live in New Orleans. There was no other place for him.
Ken withdraws $1,500 from his bank account, hops in his car, and leaves town. Neither one knows it now, but this will be the last time that Thelma sees her son alive, and she will spend the rest of her life trying to establish his legacy.
She thrust this manuscript in his hands and said, "You must read this work of genius by my genius son."
After 6 years, aspiring author John Kennedy Toole has failed to get his book, A Confederacy of Dunces, published. After a particularly nasty fight with his mother, he leaves town. Nobody knows for sure where he goes, but Ken travels around the U.S. for 66 days.
From receipts that were found in the car, we know that he went to California, visited St. Simeon. He had a friend in the Bay Area, and he may have visited him. Then he drove back and went to Milledgeville, Georgia, where his great idol, Flannery O'Connor, was from. And that's sort of the vague trajectory, but who knows where he was and what he did and all those days he was gone. Perhaps he used the journey as it was a kind of farewell tour, trying to prepare himself to commit the act he had already decided on doing.
Thelma is beside herself.
There was a frantic concern and search for him, and he just didn't turn up. She called one of his high school friends that was living in Florida at the time, and she said, "Is he there?" And he said, "No, but I'm sure Ken would never do anything to harm himself or anyone else. Don't worry." And like any concerned mother, one could only imagine 2 months of not hearing from her son, no letter, no call, no indication of where he is. It must have been absolutely horrible.
Then, on March 26, 1969, police find his car off on a secluded road outside of Biloxi, Mississippi. A green garden hose runs from the exhaust pipe into the cabin. John Kennedy Toole's body lies inside.
David Kubach was a good friend of Ken's in the Army. In fact, Ken began writing Confederacy on a portable typewriter he borrowed from David. And David came to visit Ken after they got out of the Army. One afternoon, they drove across the lake and they went to Biloxi. And Ken pulled up into a lane and they sat there a few minutes, and David thought, well, this is very strange. This is an unremarkable spot. I wonder why Ken is showing me this. But of course, that turned out to be the very spot that he committed suicide in later.
In the car is a note labeled, "To my parents."
He wrote a note to his parents, and no one knows what's in it. And for some reason, Thelma decided to destroy it.
She never reveals its contents to anyone.
She told different versions to different people. She told me that it contained insane ravings. She told slightly different versions to other people. We'll never know what was in the note. I think it perhaps put her in a bad light.
Thelma is deeply ashamed of her son's suicide.
He was buried the day after they found his body. There were 3 people at his funeral: his mother, his father, and his childhood nanny. Now, that doesn't mean that no one wanted to come to the funeral, but it happened so quickly that there was no announcement sent out inviting people to the funeral.
Many of his close friends, like Joel Fletcher, were left in the dark.
I didn't hear about his death until several months after it happened. I think they sort of kept it quiet. They didn't publicize the fact that he had died. I was very sad. I thought, what a waste. How terrible.
You can imagine at the time that suicide, as well as a kind of mental illness, carried a stigma with it.
Ken doesn't leave a will, which entitles both of his parents to his estate. While he doesn't have much, he has left behind his future literary masterpiece, A Confederacy of Dunces. Unbeknownst to his mother, it's still sitting where he abandoned it years before, in his room. Thelma remains devastated.
Her reaction, the way she described it, was that she died. Those were her words. And in some ways, it seems she did. She talks about not really being aware of anything after that for 2 years.
Thelma blamed Robert Gottlieb for everything, feeling no guilt at all on whatever role she may have played in the tragedy. Gottlieb became the scapegoat who had destroyed her genius son.
She cited the letters as evidence that Gottlieb had, as she said, lifted him up to the highest heights and then began attacking him with vitriolic attacks. Yet, she couldn't publish the letters, so everyone depended on her version of the story, and so she was able to cast him as a villain.
Gottlieb thought the book was pointless, that it was just one humorous scene after another. He saw the humor but didn't feel the underlying truth, the underlying suffering and the misplacement. He had a habit, too, of pushing young writers, pushing and pushing and pushing. And of course, John Kennedy Toole was a fragile human being.
I have no doubt that the pressure of Robert Gottlieb's critique, meeting with a lot of other different factors, may have contributed to his psychological pressure, but I don't think he single-handedly destroyed Ken. There was no indication that Gottlieb was torturing him.
Others hold his mother accountable.
Thelma was Ken's best friend and worst enemy. They had a very close relationship. She was just demanding and overpowering, and I think she just sort of smothered Ken's life. I'm sure Ken felt that he could never live up to her expectations. I think it's an undoubted fact that Thelma played an enormous role in Ken's decision to kill himself.
By this time, Thelma's husband, John, is deaf, blind, and wheelchair-bound, and they are nearly penniless. John Dewey Toole dies in 1971, leaving Thelma a grieving mother, and now also a widow. One day, she discovers a manuscript in Ken's room. Inside, she finds the pages of Dunces, and is determined to do what her son could not: get it published.
For a long time after it happened, she didn't want the book to be published because she thought it would just call attention to the fact that he had committed suicide, which was, of course, a terrible disgrace. But then one day, she decided that she had to get it published, and that's perhaps when you may say that she came to terms with her son's suicide and decided to take a positive action.
For the next 5 years, she sends the manuscript to publishers, dying a little inside every time it is returned. But she remains determined that her son's death will not be in vain.
Hers is a story of determination, of somebody going up against the odds in order to make sure that her son's memory and work is noticed. Not every day that a 70-year-old woman will go from one end of the country to another so that she can put it into the hands of every publisher that was anywhere near her.
In 1976, Thelma hears that renowned author Walker Percy is teaching at a nearby university. Percy, whose own life has been haunted by his grandfather's and parents' suicides, had published his first novel, The Moviegoer, in 1961. It won the National Book Award for Fiction in 1962. Thelma starts calling Percy regularly to see if he will agree to read her son's masterpiece. Percy manages to avoid Thelma until one day she shows up at his office.
She heard that Walker Percy, the novelist, was teaching at Loyola. She sat outside of Walker Percy's class room until he emerged, and then she sort of pounced on him, and she thrust this manuscript in his hands and said, "You must read this work of genius by my genius son." And Walker Percy was taken aback, but being a gentleman, he started reading the book, and to his astonishment, he discovered that he agreed with Thelma's belief that it was a work of genius.
Walker felt like he'd read a few pages and that would be the end of it. Apparently was overwhelmed by the book and was then very influential in getting the university here in Louisiana to accept it for publications.
In the meantime, Percy also turns to family friend Rhoda Faust. Rhoda is the owner of the well-known Maple Street bookshop and is trying to start her own publishing company. He tells her about Ken Toole's manuscript. Rhoda arranges a meeting with Thelma, who gives her a copy of Confederacy. Mesmerized by Ken's work, Rhoda tells her that she's interested in taking it on as her publishing company's first book.
Rhoda Faust was a friend of Walker Percy. There was some talk of Rhoda publishing it.
Rhoda was trying to help her get it published, and they were having trouble getting any publisher to agree. The concept was that Rhoda would publish it, but Rhoda would have to get, printing presses. And before she was able to do that, Walker Percy was able to get LSU to agree to publish the book.
Even though Rhoda knew the book could help propel her publishing company's career forward, she decides to step aside.
Thelma wanted to see Rhoda publish it, but Rhoda and Walker Percy agreed that they didn't want her to have to wait.
Around this time, Thelma also discovers the Neon Bible, the book that Ken had written for a contest when he was 16. As if to reward her for her loyalty, Thelma tells Rhoda that she can publish it. Rhoda reads the book and falls in love with it. What Rhoda doesn't realize is that within half a year, those good tidings will be a distant memory. Instead, the two women will be embroiled in a vicious lawsuit.
She could turn on you in a second.
The idea that they would get 50% of it, I think, it just was not acceptable to her.
After 6 years, the mother of deceased writer John Kennedy Toole has found a publisher for his masterpiece, A Confederacy of Dunces. But before Confederacy can be published, Thelma must convince her late husband's relatives to sign away their rights to the book.
Both Ken and his father died without wills. And according to bizarre Louisiana law, which is based on the Napoleonic Code, John Toole's brother got half his estate.
Under Louisiana law, when Ken's father died, if an asset was community property, then it would have been inherited by his mother, because community property is inherited by your spouse. But if it's separate property, then it's inherited by the relatives of the individual person who died. If he had done a will, I imagine he might have wanted to leave it to her, but he didn't have a will.
When Confederacy was about to be published, Thelma had to get the heirs, I think there were 3 nieces and 1 nephew, the descendants of John Toole's brother, to sign away their rights.
Thelma believes that if anyone should benefit financially from the book, it should be her, and her alone. She contacts her late husband's relatives. Thelma has always looked down on her husband's side of the family.
Thelma Toole had a pretty negative opinion of the Toole family.
Thelma came from a French Creole family. Her father was the clerk of court, I believe, in New Orleans, and knew many important people. She and her sisters were all very interested in the theater and in music, and it was a very cultivated background.
In contrast to her own privileged upbringing, Thelma views the Tooles as a family of uneducated laborers.
In letters, she talked about the old Toole money squeeze, where, according to her account, there were moments in their lives where the Tooles would ask Thelma and John for money, and she resented this. And in a large part, that resentment lasted for the rest of her life.
She called them unworthy people. At one point, she said they're hairdressers and they're people who buy secondhand Cadillacs.
Thelma approaches the Toole heirs with a contract giving her full rights to A Confederacy of Dunces. With an initial print of less than 2,000 copies, they never dream it will one day be worth a fortune.
Once they had read the manuscript and they realized that it didn't say anything bad about the family or anything like that, they didn't stop the publication. They had no idea what it would become. They didn't want to prevent Thelma in any way from benefiting from that.
After obtaining exclusive copyrights, Thelma is able to fulfill her dead son's wishes of seeing his book published. Good friend Joel Fletcher, who has returned to New Orleans after living in Europe, catches wind of the book's impending publication.
A friend of mine called and said, a friend of yours is having a novel published. I said, who's that? She said, his name is John Kennedy Toole. I said, well, Ken has been dead for 12 years.
After learning about Thelma's efforts to get Confederacy published, Joel decides to pay her a visit.
I parked my car and I went up and I knocked on the door. There was Mrs. Toole in her house dress with her walker. And I said, Mrs. Toole, I said, my name is Joel Fletcher. I said, I'm sure you don't remember me, but I was a friend of Ken's and I'm just stopping by to tell you how pleased I am that his book is being published. And she said, come in, Joel, honey. She said, I was just thinking about you. And that was the beginning of our friendship.
The book is published months later, and by 1981, it's a success.
It used to puzzle me as to why it was such a universal success, and I think the key lies in the character of Ignatius.
Almost hard to believe that John Toole is not Ignatius Reilly, because Ignatius Reilly seems to be such a fully fleshed out person in the book.
He created a great character that so many people can identify. He's one of the great characters in literature, like Don Quixote.
After the book wins the Pulitzer Prize, Thelma is interviewed by the likes of the New York Times and People magazine. She's asked to appear in parades, at book signings, literary soirees, and even on talk shows.
She would often use the phrase, I'm walking in the world for my son.
She has finally reached her dream of becoming a part of the social elite.
She accepted all invitations. She was finally admitted into all the social circles of New Orleans that she had been excluded from for so many years. And she gave a series of readings. She had memorized long passages from Confederacy, and you didn't have to persuade her to perform.
But Thelma's inflated ego causes problems with Hollywood executive Scott Kramer. Back in 1980, Kramer bought the film rights to Confederacy and started the long and some say cursed journey of turning the book into a movie. The sale made Thelma rich and very demanding.
He was told by Walter Percy that she was going to be problematic, and he was entirely right.
Wanting to be more involved with the film process, Thelma begins contacting Kramer regularly.
She caught wind of Bumbershoot Productions being in town to, I guess, look around New Orleans and maybe get a feel for the city. And they never came to see her. And when she found this out, she writes this letter to Bumbershoot and tells them how upset and offended she is that they did not even come to pay their respects to her. But in that same letter, she also says that she has 20 years of theatrical training and she would like to be a consultant on the film and perhaps even play a part like Irene Riley.
She had already bought her gown for the Oscars. She wanted to make sure that the dialect was done right, that the costumes were done right, the right locations were involved. Thelma did have a dramatic background, I guess, in every sense of the term, and she definitely thought that if she wasn't in the film, she would be able to help realize the other actors' performances. I can't think of a worse recipe for a disaster than to have a busybody running around the set trying to micromanage everything. She would have been a real pain on set with. I don't think they would have been able to shoot 10 seconds of film before she yelled cut.
Despite Kramer's enthusiasm, for various reasons, the movie has a difficult time getting made.
Scott Kramer lost the rights due to all of these shakeups in upper management in Paramount. After that, it went from studio to studio. Eventually, it went back to Bumbleshot Productions, which officially sold the rights back to Paramount in the early 90s. That's when Steven Soderbergh, Scott Rudin, and Scott Kramer got involved with the attempt to bring the book to screen starring John Kennedy.
Around the same time, Rhoda Foss tries to get Thelma to commit to giving her a go-ahead on publishing the Neon Bible. Thelma says she will decide who will publish the book at a later time. An undeterred Rhoda sends Thelma a letter reminding her of her promise.
So Rhoda stepped aside for the Confederacy of Dunces, but she was sure that this verbal agreement that she had with the Neon Bible would be binding and was going to hold Thelma to it.
Irritated by Rhoda's persistence, Thelma demands that Rhoda return the manuscript.
It started as a friendship, but as with many of Thelma's friendships, it turned sour. She could turn on you in a second.
Thelma also instructs Rhoda to send back the Ken and Gottlieb letters she'd lent her. Rhoda tells her that they are lost.
Rhoda claimed that one of her employees dropped the envelope in the street and it was lost, and Thelma never believed that. She was very angry at Rhoda.
Meanwhile, Thelma knows that before anybody can publish the Neon Bible, she must have permission from her late husband's relatives. Thelma once again approaches the Tooles to ask them to sign away their rights. Aware of the success of Ken's first book, this time they refuse to make the same mistake twice. They're ready to fight for what they say is rightfully theirs, even if it means taking their aunt to court.
They realized that they had signed away a great deal of money.
But Thelma won't go away easy. She is willing to do whatever it takes to ensure her son's legacy doesn't get tarnished by her husband's money-grubbing relatives.
She wrote letters to the governor and everyone else trying to get the law changed.
After the success of Pulitzer Prize-winning author John Kennedy Toole's A Confederacy of Dunces, a dispute has broken out over his last unpublished work, the Neon Bible. While his mother promised the manuscript to publisher Rhoda Foss, legally half of the book belongs to his late father's relatives.
They realized that they had signed away a great deal of money. And so when Thelma Toole announced that there was another novel that she was considering publishing, the Tooles were not willing to sign over the rights. Just on the face value of things, it is a little strange. The Louisiana law states that the mother of the son that has passed would have to split the rights 50% with the extended family of her husband, and we're talking at this point cousins and nephews, that would go 50-50. I mean, I can relate to that. I mean, I think that is a little odd. On top of that, Ken was in some ways her project. I mean, so the Genius novel was not only the great work of her son, in some ways it was her work as well, because the Tooles really had not been there for all the times that she was exposing him to literature, and because they didn't have that role in his life, I think she felt that they did not have a just place as part of the estate.
Fueled by her contempt and dislike of her husband's family, waging battle with them became a sad obsession in Thelma's last years.
Thelma copyrights the Neon Bible and does everything in her power to twist the law.
She wrote letters to the governor and everyone else trying to get the law changed.
In her letter to the governor of Louisiana, Thelma writes that the surviving Tooles are ordinary working people with no sound education, no vestige of culture, and interminable quarreling in their family circles. They are basically and truly unfit to represent my son and share the fruits of his highly gifted creative ability. Her attempts to change the law, however, are futile. The Toole heirs launch a lawsuit while Rhoda Faust hires an attorney.
Rhoda basically started a lawsuit for a couple of different reasons. First and foremost, she wanted the rights to publish this book. Now, she didn't have a written agreement, but she had, in her mind, a very firm, ironclad verbal agreement that she was going to enforce. If she wasn't going to be able to publish this book, she wanted some damages, mainly $250,000, which would be compensation for her losing the rights to publish this book.
Battling two lawsuits, Thelma, now 82, is growing weak. She makes Ken's childhood friend and poet Kenneth Holditch her literary executor, but her time is running out. 7 days after Rhoda Faust files her lawsuit, Thelma dies in August of 1984. She donates all of A Confederacy's royalties along with her son's personal effects and letters to Tulane University. But as promised, the Neon Bible gets left to Kenneth, along with one last dig.
Thelma states in her will she does not want the Neon Bible published.
She left her half of the novel to her friend, the English professor Kenneth Holditch, on the condition that he would never let it be published because she did not want her husband's unworthy relatives to profit from the genius of her son.
Holditch tries to uphold his promise, but the Tooles sue the estate.
Kenneth engages in a 3-year battle with the Tooles, who want to see the Neon Bible published.
I've only spoken to Harold Toole, and he didn't seem to be the way that Thelma would have described the Tooles. He obviously recalled many of the things that Thelma Toole said about the family, and he was not too pleased with that. He had a sense that because it was their legal right in Louisiana to be on that estate, that they really deserved that place on the Neon Bible.
By this time, Rhoda Faust has begun pleading her case in court.
Verbal agreements are very difficult agreements to prove at the best of times. Typically, when you have a he said, she said argument, you're looking for collaborating evidence. Was a third party present when this verbal agreement was made?
Rhoda uses evidence such as press releases and personal correspondence as proof that she had a legitimate agreement with Thelma. But the courts in Louisiana do not recognize the validity of the verbal contract, and Gerald P. Federoff of State District Court rules against Rhoda. She decides to appeal in 1987, but loses again.
Rhoda ends up losing at both the trial and on appeal for a couple of different reasons. The person she was trying to enforce the verbal agreement with had passed away. She had no collaborating witnesses. After all, anybody could issue a press release saying that they were publishing a book.
Even worse is the fact that the judges found Rhoda's testimony weak.
When she gets on the stand, the judges find her unconvincing, quote unquote, in whether or not she actually believes that this verbal agreement can be valid and binding. Rhoda's case basically collapsed. The question becomes, even if Rhoda had actually won this case against Thelma, would it have actually mattered? Would Rhoda have actually won the battle but lost the war if she had actually convinced the court that this verbal agreement between her and Thelma was enforceable? After all she would have had was half the rights to publish the Neon Bible, and she would have had to go to the Toole heirs for their other half.
The Tooles, however, win their case. A judge declares that the Neon Bible must either be published or the rights be put up for public auction.
The Tooles, after 3 years, are successful in having a judge order the partition of the book unless the parties can come to a settlement. In other words, the judge is saying to the parties, if you don't agree on how the book should be published, then the book will be split between Thelma's estate and the Tooles, and perhaps published separately.
Kenneth tried to respect her wishes, but when it came up before a judge, he said, she couldn't leave you the book because she only owned half of it. And so if you can't come to an agreement, we're going to have it, put it up at a public auction as if it were a piece of real estate.
After winning the lawsuit, the Tooles file to have the manuscript be publicly auctioned. Holditch knows that no matter what the outcome, legally the book is going to have to get published.
Obviously, this wasn't an ideal situation for all involved.
A person that owns 50% of a property cannot prevent the sale of it if the other 50% wants to sell it.
Meanwhile, natural disasters and early deaths stall filming for A Confederacy of Dunces.
Not one of these people lived beyond their early 40s.
Thelma Toole, mother of the late Pulitzer Prize-winning author John Kennedy Toole, has died at the age of 82. Her last wish was to keep her son's second novel from being published and her husband's family from profiting. But after a 3-year legal battle, the Tooles have won that right. To avoid having the Neon Bible be put up for auction, Kenneth Holditch decides to make a deal with the Toole heirs.
It was determined that a person that owns 50% of a property cannot prevent the sale of it if the other 50% wants to sell it. So Kenneth Holditch was put into an odd position after the Louisiana judge said, well, if you can't decide to sell it, then it goes up for auction. And of course, that opened it up to all sorts of possibilities, and that's when they finally agreed, let's find a publisher.
Kenneth decides at this point to throw in the towel and basically agree that the Neon Bible should be published.
At that point, Kenneth and the heirs decided that they would sell the rights to Grove Press, which they did, and so the book was published.
Why publish the Neon Bible despite Thelma's wishes? A couple of different reasons. Given the success of the Confederacy of Dunces, it may have been within everyone's best interest from an artistic perspective to make sure the second great piece of literature was seen by the world. Secondly, from a much more practical perspective, after 3 years of various legal wranglings, most likely the costs of lawyers had gone up quite a bit, and someone needs to pay for the lawyers. After all, lawyers always get paid.
In 1989, the Neon Bible hits the stands.
When you consider that it was written by a 16-year-old, it's absolutely brilliant. It's sort of a pastiche of Flannery O'Connor. The reviewer in the New York Times actually gave it a better review than she gave to Confederacy.
The rights get evenly divided between Kenneth Holditch and the Toole heirs. Despite the fantastic review in the New York Times, however, the Neon Bible fails to make the same splash in the literary world as Toole's first published novel. With over 2 million copies in print worldwide and translated into 18 languages, undoubtedly, John Kennedy Toole's true legacy is still A Confederacy of Dunces.
I've been in the book business now for 22 years, and it probably is the single book that has sold more copies than any other in my store in those 22 years. Can't keep it in stock. It's constantly selling. It is a timeless and universal work of art. In a broader sense, I think the book has been instrumental in attracting people to the city.
Unlike many prize-winning novels, it's never been out of print. It's really become a classic of American literature. It's being taught in university and high school classes all around America.
Even though Hollywood executive Scott Kramer eventually regained the movie rights to A Confederacy, the film has never appeared on the big screen.
There's a lot of talk about curses on this particular film project. The first actor set to portray Ignatius Reilly was John Belushi, and he quite famously died very early on due to health problems and drug overdose. After he had John Candy, who had died of heart problems. Before that, Divine, who was set to work with John Waters on a version of this, heart problems. And then in 1997, Chris Farley, heart problems and overdose. These are people who were at the top of the game and were just about to actualize this film project when they died far too early. Not one of these people lived beyond their early 40s.
Despite all the complications, people still believe in the project.
Closest that A Confederacy of Dunces ever got to even beginning production started in 2003 under Miramax. It seemed like this film was finally going to get made, and that's when Hurricane Katrina happened. That put an indefinite delay to the production. There was no way that they could shoot in New Orleans at that point, and there was no way they could not shoot in New Orleans. It's such an integral part of the book.
More recently, there has been talk of bringing the movie back to the big screen with Zach Galifianakis lined up as a potential Ignatius.
Despite all of these problems, it still has enough people who want to see it.
What would Ken Toole's life have been like had he actually gotten to enjoy his literary fame?
Ken became what he wanted to be, a famous writer, and it's just very, very sad that he did not live to know that.
If Ken had lived to see his book reach the success that it did, I think he would have been able to get a distance from his parents' house while still supporting them sufficiently so that they could live their life and that he could live the life that he wanted to lead.
I think he would have continued to be a brilliant writer. I think he would have gone to New York and led the literary life and enjoyed that very much. And I'm sure he had other books in him, but unfortunately we'll never be able to read them.